Welcome to the Courage Over Cowardice podcast, where I cover topics and issues that will help you take a stand for Christ in culture. More than ever, followers of Jesus need courage to stand up, speak up, and to live out their faith, because people need to know that there's a God in heaven that loves them, and it is His truth that sets people free. Thanks for listening today, and I hope that you enjoyed the episode. Hey, I want to thank you for tuning in today to the Courage Over Cowardice podcast. It's my honor to have today Tim Barton. Timothy Barton's the President of WallBuilders, a national pro-family organization that presents America's forgotten history and heroes with an emphasis on religious, moral, and constitutional heritage. WallBuilders has been recognized from coast to coast for its work in education, history, law, public policy, integrating the elements of biblical faith and morality throughout all the aspects of American life and culture. Tim is an ordained minister. He's worked in a variety of staff positions. He's been interviewed everywhere. If you haven't seen him yet, you'll see him everywhere now. And he also, I remember overhearing this, you've been training jiu-jitsu for some time as well. So there you go.
Well,
welcome.
Pastor, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
So I wanted to talk today. I love your ministry and what you and your father and family do together. In fact, I just kind of starting out, one of the things that I do in the evening, a few nights a week, over our dinner table, I picked up the book, The American Story, The Beginnings, and I read a chapter to my kids, and we just kind of talk about all those things. And I'm getting an education all over again about just, the Christian faith within the history of America is so real and so powerful. And so just jumping into it, I was hoping you'd talk to us a little bit today about America's godly heritage. We're in the United States of amnesia, where we've forgotten where we've come from. We believe the lies, or many believe the lies of the nonsense that's propagated by the 1619 Project, and history is being rewritten. And if we don't know, if we don't know who we are and who we were, then we'll be whatever people tell us that we are. And we're seeing that within our culture. So I was just hoping today and on the podcast, you would enlighten us, educate us, and speak to these super important issues.
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation. Something that as a believer, we obviously want to center our lives on the Word of God, and Jesus in John 14:6, when he said that He's the way, the truth, and the life, no one comes to the Father except through Him. There's something significant about identifying that God is truth. Truth comes from God, and ultimately Jesus is truth revealed. Why all that matters, in John 8:32, he told the disciples that you would know the truth, and the truth would set you free. And we are in a nation right now that anybody who's paying attention at all recognizes there's some major problems. And maybe those of us who are paying a lot of attention recognize that there's what the Apostle Paul would describe as some spiritual warfare taking place, where, in Ephesians 6, Paul said we don't wrestle just against flesh and blood, and it's against powers and principalities. And then he goes through this list, and that's why he tells us, you need to put on the full armor of God. And what's, again, worth noting about this is you put on the belt of truth. It's the very first thing you start with. You start with truth, because if there is no truth, nothing else really matters. If we're not girding ourselves with truth, then we will not be prepared to defend ourselves against the wiles of the devil. And as you've identified already, so many areas we could talk about, whether it be the Christian foundation of this nation, whether it be some of the lies that are being perpetuated and that are permeating so much of the cultural conversation today. One of the things that I feel like as Christians, we've not done a very good job on is pursuing truth in a lot of regards. And I think partly sometimes we get lazy. And, Pastor, it'd be easy for us to go, hey, we trust our pastor. If he says something, we're just going to believe what he says. And of course, as a pastor, that if it were only that easy, your life would not be as filled with drama as at times it is, because there's a natural, healthy skepticism in humans, which is actually, it's a healthy, good thing. And yet we have become so gullible and so trustworthy in areas we shouldn't be. And it reminds me of the Apostle Paul when he was in Acts 17, he's talking with the Berean church, or to the Christians, I guess in Berea. There wasn't the Berean church yet, but right at this point, as he's witnessing to them, explaining to them the gospel and Jesus, there is no New Testament. And so presumably what he's doing is he's probably going to places like Isaiah, and he's explaining how Jesus fulfilled the prophecies of Isaiah. And as he's explaining this, he gets called out, and people go, wait a second, I'm not sure I trust this guy. And somebody, right, presumably is like, hey, somebody go with the scroll of Isaiah, and they bring out the scroll and they look and they're like, oh, Isaiah did say that. Okay, yeah. Paul, you may continue. And right, he probably goes on, and then he gets into Joel, and they're like, wait a second, somebody get the scroll of Joel. And as Paul is explaining the gospel to them, nobody believes anything he says until they've confirmed the truth for themselves. And the Apostle Paul actually praises them for that. He says, no one will mislead you because they were pursuers of truth. And we have become as Christians fairly lazy in a lot of regards, that we're just trusting if it's in a book, we trust it. If it was on social media, if it's on the news, we trust it. And there's probably a little less trust since COVID, right? Than maybe there was before COVID. But for many people now,
best things that happened, yeah.
Right, but many people are like, wait a second, I sense something is wrong when someone says don't question the science, and like the very nature of science is to ask questions, and we're not. That doesn't make any sense anymore. I think for a lot of people, we're waking up to the reality that we've been misled in many regards. But the reason I want to lay that contextual foundation is because as we back up to have some of these conversations, I could say things, we would have a conversation about things that historically are absolutely undeniably true. And there would be people listening going, I don't know if I believe that. I'm not sure if I trust that. And first of all, what I would assure, it's okay for people that want to question. Truth is not insecure. And I think this is a very important thing. Truth is not insecure and does not mind being questioned. It is only lies that need to prevent the honest questioning, because they will be exposed as liars. And so when someone is saying, hey, we need to censor that person, right? We shouldn't let them post that. We shouldn't let them ask those questions. You should be asking additional questions of why are they trying to censor that person? Truth is not insecure. And in the history of Christianity, I am someone who really loves apologetics. And some of the greatest apologists in Christianity, whether it be a C.S. Lewis or a Josh McDowell, Lee Strobel, some of these incredible thought leaders over the last 100 years were skeptics who, in honest questioning, they wanted to disprove Christianity at times. But they were actually looking for what was true. And as they began to pursue truth, they found truth, and they found that God was real, that Jesus was real, that the Bible was true. And the reason, again, I want to lay this contextual foundation because I have a feeling as our conversation evolves that there might be people that go, wait a second, you're suggesting that not all the founding fathers were racist, that you're suggesting that, right, the founding fathers actually believed in Jesus and that they actually promoted equality. The founding fathers, the majority of them were anti-slavery. And we could have conversations about things that are so countercultural. If people have just been listening to culture for a long time, it would take them aback because it's not what they're used to hearing. And this is where I want to lay the foundation. What we care about is what's true. We're not going to promote, right, what the right says, what the left says, what Republicans say, what Democrats say. We're going to say, well, what does the Bible say? Number one. And number two, what is historically true? And this is where I want to lay this foundation just so as people are listening, if there's honest questions, man, I'm not insecure. Pastor, I know you're not insecure. Right? If someone has a theological question, if someone has a historical question, let's just go back and let's see what the Bible says, right, about a theological question. Historically, let's go back and let's see what the records show us about these people, about these moments and these events. And kind of to your initial lead, one of the things that's very quick to see from the founding fathers' writings, and even before them, but it's the Christian foundation of the nation. If you go back to the early colonists and settlers coming to America, why were they coming in the first place? The vast majority of colonists and settlers that were coming to America, people like the Pilgrims. Why were the Pilgrims coming? They were coming looking for religious freedom. They were escaping religious persecution being done under the King of England, under the Church of England. But the same thing, we could look through people coming from Germany or from France. We could look at the Puritans coming 10 years after the Pilgrims, and then there were more than 10,000, some say 20,000 Puritans that came over the next 10 years. The reality is nearly everybody that was coming to America, that the largest portion of the population were seeking religious freedom. And these are the founding fathers. This is their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents. This is the foundation that America was laden. You go back to William Penn. He was a Quaker who had been imprisoned by the king for not being an Anglican. And William Penn's father was the Admiral William Penn, who had been very successful in the British Navy and had won many battles for the king. And the king actually owed him a commission and a royalty for royalty, like financial royalty, for the victories he had won. And so the king, to Admiral William Penn, gave a portion of land in his new territory, which was America, the United States of America, what ultimately became. But he gave him the land mass known as Pennsylvania. William Penn came to Pennsylvania, actually sent Quakers before him, but they established a Quaker colony in Pennsylvania. Why? Because they were seeking religious freedom. This is the foundation of America. And when you get to the founding fathers, they carried on this same tradition. And people don't often see it today. We have the opportunity and privilege at WallBuilders that we go through their original writings. We have what's considered the largest private collection of original writings from the founding fathers. And we're able to go through the original writings of George Washington or John Adams or Thomas Jefferson or even Benjamin Franklin. And as you go through their writings, you realize so much of what is said about them is just not historically accurate. For example, we hear today that many of the founding fathers, they were atheists or agnostics or deists. And I can unequivocally say, if you look, for example, at the signers of the Declaration, there were 56 signers of the Declaration. Of all the signers of the Declaration, none of them were an atheist. None of them were an agnostic. And only one of them ever self-identified as a deist. That individual was Benjamin Franklin. But what I can also say for context is he self-identified as a deist in his autobiography. And we actually have the original printing of his autobiography. And now this is also something you can find online. So as I'm saying we have the original writings, I'm not suggesting that nobody else can see this and find this. You can find this online. You can read it online. In fact, you can find a searchable PDF online. And even you can go to google.books.com or books.google.com. It's one of those two. But you can look for the autobiography of Franklin. And if you do a word search and type in deist, what you will see pop up. This is early in his autobiography. He said when he was 15 years old, he was listening to a group of deists, and they were laying out their argument for why they thought deism was the most logical position to have. And Franklin says, he's 15 years old. He said, then he listened to several pastors, and they gave a rebuttal to the deists of why the deists were wrong. And Franklin says, at the end of listening to him, he says, I determined that I think the deists had better arguments than the pastors did. So Franklin says, so I determined I would be a deist. Next line, he says, but I soon realized that although deism might be true in some merits, that the belief itself was of no use to me and of no benefit to anybody else, so I quickly left that belief behind.
Wow.
The only founding father who ever self-identified for a deist, it was when he was 15. And if you read his autobiography, it sounds like he was a deist for like a day and a half. And then he left the belief. Now, the reason, again, I want to illustrate is when you read their writings often give a very different indication of who they were than what the modern narrative is. And most people have just never really read their writings to see what was actually said. And I mean, Pastor, you know this. One of the challenges we have inside of Christianity is there are so many Christians that profess Jesus that have never read or studied the Bible. And so their lifestyle might not be very reflective of Jesus. You probably should spend some time reading the book you say you base your life on. That makes a lot of sense to me. But it's similar when people are like, oh, I know the founding fathers. I've never read their writings, but I know the founding fathers. I would push back pretty hard on that and say that doesn't make any sense, right? To say that you know for a fact that a founding father was a certain thing, that they were a racist, that they were a secularist, they were an atheist. You've never even read into their writings. Why would you draw that conclusion? And this is where we would encourage people as truth seekers, as truth pursuers, to not just buy the narrative that culture is telling us. We should be smart enough at this point to know that so much of what we are being told in culture is dishonest at best. And at worst, it's intentionally misleading to try to produce a different result in society.
Yeah. Well, that's there's so much truth there. And, you know, one of the things that I was struck by I said we were been reading that book with my kids is the depth of the Christian faith and the underpinnings of our nation, of the culture. I was reading just a few things. I'll just throw this out here to kind of echo what you're saying. The Mayflower Compact stated the reason the Pilgrim came to America was for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith. The constitutions of all the original 13 colonies acknowledged God and mandated scriptural education in the public schools. The one textbook used by nearly every public school student was the McGuffey Reader, which said the scriptures are specially designed to make us wise unto salvation through faith in Jesus Christ. Our first Congress began with a 3-hour prayer meeting and Bible study. I mean, you can just go on and on through the history of our nation, but listening to the talking heads and the books that are out today, there's an intentional rewriting of that. Just speak to that just for a moment. Why do you think that is? Just your perspective. In one sense, it's kind of obvious, but in another sense, it's so deliberate. It's so intentional. It's so all-encompassing. It seems like every platform, everyone is kind of combining together for that. So maybe just speak to that for a moment.
Yeah, I think there's actually some depth on that answer as well, because there's several things we can point to. One thing worth noting is if you go back to the early 1900s, when progressives took over the educational structure and system, progressives were taking over so much in America at that time that they were very involved in politics. They began universities. Actually, up until the 1920s, there were not high schools in America. We had 8 levels of school. And levels were even different than grades. Levels, not all that dissimilar from a video game. You have to beat level 1 to make it to level 2. And it doesn't matter how long it takes you to beat level 1. You don't go to level 2 until you beat level 1. And, I had cousins who were big into video games, and they might get a video game and they'd beat it in one night or over the weekend. They'd stay up the whole weekend playing this video game to beat it. And, I grew up in a home. We didn't really have video games. We played outside and we did other things that were considered more productive and constructive. And so if I got to play video games, it might have been for a couple minutes, a couple days a week. So to beat the first level on like a Super Mario brother kind of game, it might have taken me a year and a half, where it took them a day. But this was early education. It didn't matter how long it took you. You have to master that content. And what's super interesting is when you have kind of the industrial complex, the industrial revolution happening in America, you have individuals like Rockefeller, and this is him on record, where he said that we don't need to produce individual thinkers. And he's talking about education. He said, we don't need to produce individual thinkers. We need to produce people who are better at taking orders and would be better workers in the factory. So they were intentionally shifting. We're not trying to make people critical thinkers and problem solvers anymore. We are actually trying to make them where everybody's gullible and whatever the president says, whatever some medical head says, whatever anybody says, everybody's going to say, okay, we have to do what we're told. Part of what we are seeing happen today, I think, is a result of something that happened at this point 100 years ago. And we're just seeing the fruits of that ever present and evident right now in our life. The other thing I think probably is maybe a little bit more the direction you were going is, if you look the last 60 years in America, the founding fathers have been villainized for the last 60 years incessantly, right? Consistently, without cease, 60 years. If you go back to the 60s and 70s, the founding fathers were accused of being sexually immoral individuals, of fathering all these illegitimate children, all these affairs, right? That was a slander put against them. If you go to the 80s and 90s, they were accused of being immoral and irreligious. They were atheists and agnostics and deists. They wanted to separate from church and state. If you come to the 2000s to the present, they were accused and are being accused of being these racist, bigoted slaveholders and really evil men. Why for 60 years has there been a consistent attack against the founding fathers? And I think this is more to what we are seeing realized in America is there were people smart enough to know that if you want to fundamentally change America from a constitutional republic and make America into a Marxist, socialist, communist nation, you can't just tell people, hey, we don't like the Constitution, let's throw it out and do something else. Instead, if you can villainize the individuals who gave us the Declaration, if you can villainize the individuals who gave us the Constitution, then over time, you can then make the argument that, well, we shouldn't have the Declaration or the Constitution anyway, because that came from really awful, terrible, evil men. We need to write something different that didn't come from those awful, terrible, evil men. And that's what we're seeing today. We are seeing an attempt to remove the foundation, that the fundamental bedrock of America. America was built on the notion that there was a creator God, and that he gave rights to man, and government's primary purpose was to protect those God-given rights. The founding fathers in the Declaration phrased it, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. The Declaration was the very first governing document anywhere in the world to remove title, class, nobility, and rank from the equation. To say that we were all created equal. And some people even argue that this only shows the racism of the founding fathers because they argued for equality for white people and right at the same time they held slaves and they were racist. I would encourage people, go back and read the original draft of the Declaration. Because in the original draft, when they actually get to the grievances, the issues we had against the king, the largest grievance, it was the last one. There was 24 grievances in the original draft. This was the 24th grievance, and it is by far the largest grievance. It's nearly half a page. The largest grievance in the original draft of the Declaration was condemning the king for the slave trade, for forcing all the colonies in America to participate in the slave trade, and acknowledging that every time one of the colonies had passed laws to end the slave trade or to end slavery in their states, the king always vetoed those laws. That was in the original draft of the Declaration. That was one of the reasons we wanted to separate from the king. And the reason it didn't make it in the final draft was because John Hancock, who was the president of Congress, said they would only include in the final draft what was unanimously agreed to by the body. Because John Hancock in wisdom said, if we put things in here that we don't all agree to, the king might be able to come in and pull us apart by our own local separate interests. So we're only going to include in the final draft what is unanimous, which is why even the opening title of the Declaration says the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. Well, go back to this anti-slavery grievance in the original draft. There were only two colonies that opposed it. North Carolina and Georgia. At that time, they said, South Carolina and Georgia. I apologize, North Carolina. South Carolina and Georgia, they said, we have not yet tried to end the slave trade or to pass laws against slavery in our state, so we don't have this grievance. So John Hancock removed it, but it's worth noting 11 of the original 13 colonies voted in favor of it. Now, the reason this matters, go back to the actual wording that was ratified from that Congress where they said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They'd already clarified in the first draft that the Africans in slavery were included in that men. It's actually part of the grievance. So when they're saying all men are equal, they're saying all humanity. All humanity. And why? Because we know as a Christian, right? We were all made in God's image. I think it's really worth noting as a Christian. Go back and read Genesis. When God made man and woman his image, you can read it first in Genesis 1, 26 and 27. But it's worth noting. Nowhere in Genesis does it tell us what shape, size, or color Adam and Eve were.
Yes.
We have no idea. Why? Because that's not the important part of the story. That's not where value comes from. Value comes from the fact that we were made in the likeness and the image of God. We are the bearers of Christ and God in our own life. But this is what the founding fathers knew. And their premise was that there's no classes, there's no ranks, there's no nobility, right? The lords and nobles and the peasants and serfs. They said, no, we're all equal. And we've all been given rights from our creator, inalienable rights, and government's job is to protect those rights. We are now, Pastor, at a place where you have members of Congress that are saying that the government should determine who gets what's rights and who gets to enjoy what rights. We have fundamentally forgotten government is not the creator of our rights. God is the one who gave us our rights. Government's job is to protect our God-given rights. But this is part of the move we've seen over the last 60 years. How can you get society to go from a place where they believe in God-given rights to go to a place where they believe, well, we need the government to tell us what we can and can't do and where we can go and where we can work and where we can spend our money and what we can't spend our money on? How do you lead a society that far? Well, part of their strategy has been we have to villainize all of the people that told us that there was a God and there was God-given rights. It's also why there's a move now to say everyone is a Christian. Well, if you're a Christian, you're bigoted and you're racist and you're hateful. they're trying to slander us to make us be quiet and go, I'm so sorry, I don't mean any harm. Well, what are we saying? What we are saying are things like, hey, male and female are a real thing, right? Like that actually does exist. We're saying things as outrageous as, probably we shouldn't have biological males competing against women, right? Like probably that makes sense. Probably things like we shouldn't allow transgender drag shows for elementary students.
Yeah.
Like that should not even be controversial. And yet we live in a world that is promoting that evil. And then they're name calling to Christians who would have the audacity to oppose something that literally is that evil.
Yeah. No, you're right. And I think that's why we need to know our history. We need to know the Bible. And we also need to engage in the public square because as we allow these things to continue to be promoted and not stand up against them, I think what happens, in our hearts is we begin to believe that the social engineering and the propaganda through the media, through social media, and all, that most people agree with it. Now, it wouldn't make it right even if most people did agree with it, but the reality is that most people don't agree with it. It's a small, well-organized, vocal minority, and that's why it's so important for us to not just have an opinion, but to have God's opinion, and to not be so easily dissuaded from truth. Like to say you can learn 2 + 2 from an axe murderer. It doesn't make it untrue. It may not be comfortable to learn from them, but it has no bearing on whether or not that thing is true. And so the founding fathers, as amazing as they were, the reality is it doesn't really matter. We've been given this incredible gift of freedom and liberty, which is unique in human history. And let's talk about that for a few moments and maybe push back specifically. We have something in our culture that's, and I'll let you kind of say it, but the 1619 Project and its goal, as you were already speaking to, is to restate or re-envision what America was and what it should be. And so maybe for someone that's listening to this, that they read this, they watched some documentary, they were taught this in school, what's some of the fundamental problems with the 1619 Project? Let's just go there for a few moments.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of fundamental problems and issues, as you're alluding to. It's worth noting that when the 1619 Project came out, that there were many historians, including leftist historians that are not Christian, don't identify as Christian. They said, this is just incorrect history. But the Miss Jones, who was the primary author, the inspiration behind this, and she has a lot of writers on the team now, but she said that her goal was to change the narrative. And she said, I don't care if this is not historically right. I want to change the narrative. Yeah. You should already be weary when somebody says, I don't care what's true. I just want to promote my agenda, right? That's already a problem. Yeah. And this is something I mentioned from the very beginning. As I'm telling stuff, I encourage people, don't take my word for this. Like, genuinely, go look up and see what she said. The opening article that she put out on the 1619 Project website, the first article, she made the claim that the American Revolution was fought to preserve slavery in America.
Yeah.
She said the founding fathers knew if they didn't win the revolution, they couldn't keep their slaves. Okay. Now,
bizarre.
That is wrong and dumb on lots of levels.
Yeah.
But like the obvious easy thing is, even in the final draft of the Declaration, they listed 27 grievances of why we separated from Great Britain. And none of them was because we wanted to preserve and protect slavery. In fact, if you go back to the original draft, it actually was because we tried to end slavery and the slave trade, and the king wouldn't let us because we were British colonies. And I can go into that a lot more detail. As you mentioned, our book, The American Story, we actually tell some of that story, and it's footnoted in there with lots of footnotes, lots of resources, because we encourage people, don't take our word for it. Let's show you what actually happened. Yeah. With that being said, the premise of the 1619 Project is that America actually began in 1619 when there were 19 slaves that arrived in Jamestown. And from that moment on, all of America was built and birthed on the back of slaves. and everything that we think is good that came from America came because of slavery, and therefore it's not really good. And white people are only evil oppressors, and black people or people with darker skin have only ever been oppressed, and that's the legacy of America. That is the premise of the 1619 Project. Now, to unfold a little bit more of that, it's worth noting that African slavery, and specifically the North Atlantic slave trade, it was coming into America way before 1619. And part of that context, if you go back to Christopher Columbus, he's the guy for Western Europe. He's the guy who discovered there's this land over here uninhabited. And Columbus made 4 voyages. And Columbus is another guy who gets victimized really wrongly and unjustly from a lot of bad history in many regards. Not that he was perfect. And Pastor, I'm gonna sidetrack for a minute. We're gonna come back to Columbus in context for slavery in America. But one of the things that's so silly too, when we look at these historic figures, when people try to villainize them, it also reveals to me in many regards the lack of biblical worldview for even Christians that are saying this. Because one of the obvious things, our starting place as Christians is that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. What does that mean?
Correct.
It means everybody is jacked up and everybody needs Jesus. Right? Like the reason Jesus came is because nobody's perfect. The Bible tells us, Paul wrote, that there is none righteous, no, not one. Everybody is a sinner who needs a savior. So why am I laying this out in context? Because my starting place, if I study anybody historically, if I study George Washington, who I think is one of the most honorable and most incredible great Americans in American history. Yeah. If I study him, I'm not studying him thinking, right, this is some godlike figure. I'm studying him thinking, this is a imperfect, fallible human being who needed Jesus just as much as I do, right? Just as much as everybody else does. This wasn't a perfect person. He has flesh just like we have flesh. He had to learn to crucify the flesh and walk in the spirit, and old things had to pass away and all things had to become new. He was a normal person like we are. I'm not thinking of him in any different regard. And the reason that matters is because if someone ever pointed out to me a time and they're like, can you believe George Washington did this? I would say, yeah. Right? Like, why would I be surprised when a human has a fleshly moment? That should be our expectation. What is more unique, what is more special is when you see God use such imperfect and fallible individuals and do great things through them. That's where it's more impressive. If we take the example of King David from the Bible, right? It's super easy example. King David, the most amazing worshiper we have an example of in scripture. He wrote the majority of the book of Psalms. We know he was an amazing warrior because he kills Goliath as a teenager. Scholars believe he was between 14 and 17 years old when he killed Goliath. And when he even talks to Saul to nominate himself to go fight Goliath, Saul says, I'm not sure that you can handle this. And David says, oh, it's fine. I've already killed lions and I've killed bears protecting my father's sheep. Well, if he was only 14 when he killed Goliath, that means he was killing lions and bears when he was 11 and 12 and 13, which is just a crazy thought to imagine a child. Because this is not a kid with a high caliber and high powered rifle. This is a kid with a rock and a stick. And David actually told Saul that when a bear or lion would catch a sheep in its mouth and they'd run away, he would chase them down to kill them. This is a kid looking for a fight. Like, David was an amazing warrior. I mean, genuinely, the dude was good at killing things. But we also know the Bible doesn't stop there. The Bible tells us the whole story because the Bible then gets into David as a father, and it tells us about Amnon, the son who, right, raped his sister, and David did nothing. David does not get involved in the situation. Hearing the story, Absalom finds out his sister got raped, and Absalom's like, I will solve this problem. Absalom kills his brother. David did nothing. Absalom begins to think, my dad's a weak leader and ruler. So Absalom sets himself up at the city gates, begins taking power from his father, finally decides he's going to overthrow and take the throne from his father, leads a violent revolution. There's a war with Absalom's men against David, and David runs. David had the mighty men, the guys that, right? The guy by himself who defended a bean patch. And like, you start reading the stories of these mighty men, all David had to do was tell any of them, like, hey, go deal with this guy and we're done. David did nothing. He ran. And I can imagine my imagination. The Bible doesn't give great clarity, but my imagination is it had to be one of the warriors who came to him and finally like, David, can we please just deal with this guy? Can we please just go to war and end this thing? And finally, right, the people know the story. Absalom's hair gets caught in a tree. David's men use him as javelin practice, and that's the end of Absalom. Well, then in 1 Kings Chapter 1, verse 5, it introduces us to Adonijah. And Adonijah wanted to be the ruler, and Adonijah starts setting himself up. And the Bible tells us that Adonijah was a son whom David never corrected. David was a terrible father, because the Bible tells us the father disciplines the son he loves. The father, right? Our job is to offer insight, instruction, and correction. Hey, don't do that. Come over here. Stay away from that. David did none of it. On top of it, then David has the affair with Bathsheba. David murders Uriah, her husband. David has got so much drama and junk in his life. And here's the relevant portion for the conversation is we live in a modern culture that says, well, then we should cancel David, right? Like we should never sing any of the Psalms of David, because we'd be singing the Psalms of a murdering, adulterer, terrible father. We can't sing those Psalms. And Pastor, you know that you're not going to find a single Sunday where we don't sing a song that has some portion of a psalm in that song. That is what we sing every weekend. How do we sing the Psalms of David knowing he was so imperfect? Because our starting place is David was not perfect. We're not singing the Psalms because we think David was perfect. Instead, the entire life of David, we recognized how a perfect God used an imperfect person and did great things through him. And it doesn't excuse the humanity of David. We can tell the whole story and be honest. Say, man, David had some great moments in his life, and David had some really bad moments in his life. But it doesn't change the fact that God used David in significant ways to do significant things. And this is the context with the founding fathers. And let me go back to Columbus now, because people want to villainize Columbus and say he was awful and terrible and evil. He wasn't perfect, but he's also not guilty of most crimes of which he's accused. But let me add a little more context. Columbus was an Italian sailing for Spain. Spain was one of the main instigators, one of the leaders in the North Atlantic slave trade, right? Because you had the Muslims that were slave traders, and the Portuguese and the Dutch and the Spanish. Those were major players in the Atlantic slave trade. Well, when Columbus discovers this new world and he's selling for the Spanish begin building colonies. In the 1500s, they're building colonies in continental North America. And in all of their colonies that have been documented to this point, all of their colonies, they brought over African slaves from the slave trade. So even the notion that Jamestown was the first colony to have African slaves, that's totally incorrect. Now, the argument might be it was the first English colony. Well, maybe, but then here's where I would also give more context to push back. The 19 slaves that arrived in Jamestown were on a Portuguese slave trading ship. There was a Dutch ship that was being crewed primarily by British soldiers. And I know it's a lot of weird details, but there was British sailors that were on this Dutch ship. They conquered the Portuguese ship. And when they were a privateer ship, so they're basically pirates. That's basically what they were. They capture this Portuguese ship. They take these 19 slaves off, and they realize we don't have the food. We don't have the supplies for them. We need to go unload them. And as pirates, they're just trying to make money. So they think, where can we go sell them? They go to Jamestown to sell these 19 slaves, or these 19 individuals who were on a slave ship on the way to go be slaves. When this ship gets to Jamestown and these British soldiers are now going to try to sell these slaves, they discover something unique about Jamestown. Slavery was illegal in 1619 in Jamestown. So they show up and they say, hey, we have these slaves to sell. And they say, well, we don't really have slavery here. And right, logically, they're trying to make money. Okay, well, then what do you have here? And the people of Jamestown, the leaders, are like, well, we have indentured servitude. And they said, fine. We will sell you 19 indentured servants. But this is a distinction with a significant difference. Indentured servitude had a specified period of years, and usually it was 7 years. And at the end of that time, in the Jamestown colony, not only were you given your freedom, you were also given a parcel of land. And depending on where in the time frame, it was anywhere between 40 all the way up to 250 acres. So those original 19 slaves, when they arrive in the Jamestown colony, they became indentured servants. And at the end of 7 years, or whatever their term was, they found freedom and they became landowners. There are records from Jamestown that by 1633, those original 19 slaves, not only were they all free and landowners, but in 1633, they were beginning to indenture other servants to come work their farms. They had gone from being slaves to being free landowners in America, where they were indenturing servants to come work for them. Also, to give a little context, if you look at where the North Atlantic slave trade went, the vast majority of slaves went to Central and South America or to islands in the Caribbean. And I mean, like, the vast majority of the 12.7 million slaves that came out of Africa, only 380,000 made it to the North American continent. The rest went to somewhere Central, South America, or the Caribbean islands. And if you look at the lifespan of a slave, for example, if they were going to Cuba, if they were going to Brazil, what is the lifespan in that time for a slave? The best estimates are a lifespan for a slave at that time would have been 1 to 3 years in slavery. So these individuals who were enslaved on this Portuguese ship, I would argue, and this is a hot take, I know, but I would argue one of the best things that possibly could have happened in their life was for that ship to have been intercepted, for them to have been taken on board this other Dutch ship and brought to Jamestown, because in the Jamestown colony, they were not made slaves. They were indentured servants. And at the end of their 7 years, they found freedom and they became free landowners in America. That is a very different narrative than what we are being told today. And this doesn't mean that America didn't have slavery. It doesn't mean that's not a major blot and sin and stain on America's past. And it doesn't mean that there weren't some awful things extended and promoted through the slave industry in America. But It's also not giving the full context of the story of even how it happened, or right, the notion, the argument today is America is systemically racist. And what that means is all of our structures have been set up with systems of racism. You could make that argument before the Civil War when there actually was a system of slavery. But here's also where there's context. So the founding fathers are the ones who begin laying the foundation for this notion that we are all created equal, that we all have equal rights. In fact, when you look at a William Wilberforce over in England who helps abolish slavery in England, he actually references things from the Declaration in his arguments and letters that it's the foundation the founding fathers laid that started the abolition movement anywhere in the world. In fact, the founding fathers were the first political leaders anywhere in the world to take these stances. And I can go much further with some of the things. They actually did pass laws with the Northwest Ordinance that any new territories coming in, they had to come in as anti-slavery territories. They couldn't have slaves in those territories. There was a lot we did, but people would say, yeah, but America it took us so long to end slavery in America. This is, again, where context matters. England was the first nation, arguably, to abolish slavery in 1833. But let me back you up. The Declaration on the original draft, 11 of the original 13 colonies had come out against the slave trade and against slavery. Well, we didn't have that in the final draft of the Declaration because of South Carolina and Georgia. But when we separate from Great Britain and all the founding fathers go to their home states and they start writing their state constitutions, one of the things that became law in virtually every single northern state was they began passing anti-slave trade laws and anti-slavery laws, so much so that by 1804, every single northern colony had passed laws to abolish slavery. The reason it was even 1804 was because New Jersey and New York took so long for them to pass the anti-slavery laws. But the New England colonies of America passed laws to abolish slavery 30 years before England did. And Again, right, England is considered today to be like the shining bastion of the anti-slavery movement. Well, the New England colonies were 30 years before them, and then they go further. So England ended slavery in 1833. Then you had Denmark. Then you had France. America was the fourth major nation anywhere in the world to abolish slavery. And America abolished slavery at the end of the Civil War. And this is also worth noting. The Civil War, you have nearly 700,000 people who lose their lives in the Civil War. And it's the only war in history where white people fought a war against other white people. And at the end of that war, they freed all of the black people. America paid a higher price in ending slavery than anywhere else in the world. And to go further,
true.
There's 193 member nations that are part of the UN. There was a study that came out, I think it was in 2020. The study came out that identified 94 nations that are part of the UN still have not passed laws to abolish slavery or the slave trade to this day. Slavery is still, it's why we know in China, the Uyghur Muslims are enslaved in China right now. We can point to nations where slavery is legal. And here's also, I want to add even more context. Here's why this matters, because there is actually tracking where there's groups and organizations like the global slave trade. They will track and see what nations are doing the most to oppose slavery. And what they've discovered is that the number one nation in the world right now opposing slavery is the Netherlands. And that is by percentage of what they're giving. America is the number two nation in the world opposing slavery, but we are number one by volume, and it's not even close. And here's why all this matters. America started earlier, paid a higher price, and still does more today than virtually anywhere else in the world to oppose slavery. And yet, we are being told by the 1619 Project, by critical race theory, that we have one of the worst slavery records in the history of the world, when the reality is We have arguably the best anti-slavery record in the history of the world. The problem is we don't know what other nations did. And so when someone says America's so bad, here's the question we should ask. Compared to who?
Yeah, that's very good. That's very good.
I could keep going. I just feel like I've talked for such a long time, and there might be a different direction.
Yeah, no, that was fantastic. You know, when we think about the issue of slavery and them attempting to narrow our history just to one issue. You know, you were talking about David. Let me just say that for a moment, and then I have another question to go with you. You know, we know that Jesus, our Savior, came through the lineage of David. And the Scripture tells us that David served God's purpose in his generation and fell asleep. So we're not canceled from God's plan because of our past and our failures and our weaknesses. Mm-hmm. And we see America has been used by God in such incredible ways. And even with all of our current failings, still being used by God in a variety of ways. And there's this war, information war, spiritual war that's ongoing for our country. And, you know, I was thinking about, there's a couple myths I'm going to ask you about, I want you to speak to in just a few moments. But my wife asked me, she said, make sure that you ask him this. And it was specifically about the order of God, country, family, those things. And you guys, you had shared about that, and that really kind of struck a chord with us. And I was hoping you'd talk about that for a few moments. Yeah,
one of the things that we know, God created several institutions. We know he created the family. We know he created the government. We know he created the church. And so often as Christians, we have a hard time prioritizing, even as individuals, right? As fathers, as husbands, there can be a challenge to prioritize and find that balance of where do we spend time? What do we do? There's an interesting, and this is to your question, there's an interesting kind of, in Benjamin Rush's writings, he has a writing, and I wasn't sure if to call it like a letter or an essay, but it's one of his writings. He said that his priority was God first, and then country, and then family. And I think most of us who are attentive Christians, we would say that's backwards. It should be God first, and then your family, because obviously that's who God's put you over, right? As the husband, as the wife, as the father, as the mother, we're supposed to be over our family to raise them up in the fear and admonition of the Lord. And I mean, that it just seems backwards. It's God and then family and then country. And Benjamin Rush said that the reason he put God and then country and then family, he said, because if you ever lose your country, then your country will become the enemy of your family, and you will lose your family because of your country. He said, so it's God, and then you better pay attention to your country so that you can protect and preserve your family. And I think there's some truth in that. If Christians would have done a better job paying attention, then some of the things we're seeing happening in some of these school districts right now, I mean, it's genuinely crazy what some of these teachers are doing and some of what they're promoting and the sexualization of children, of little kids. It's crazy. Yeah. What we are seeing.
Very evil.
Is right. We are seeing that in many ways, institutions in our country have become the enemy of our family. And this is what Benjamin Rush warned about. He said, if you just focus on your family and you don't pay attention to your country becomes the enemy of your family, and then you lose your country and your family. He said, if you will put God first and then pay attention to your country and then your family, and obviously there's still a balance, right? We're not discounting family. You know, for anybody listening, please don't think that I'm saying don't prioritize family. Obviously, that's not what we're saying. But we've so discounted the role of Christians in society and in government, in the school boards, in the city council, in the state legislature, that we have seen so much bad policy, bad decisions, bad directions, bad hires. Some of these teachers have no business being around our kids. And because Christians haven't been involved, most Christians, like we have no idea. If we said, hey, who is your state representative? Most Christians don't know who their state representative is. So they surely don't know if they're a godly person or not. If we said, who's on the school board in your town? Most Christians don't know. And statistically, the vast majority of Americans send their kids to public schools, and they have no idea who is leading the direction of that public school. And this again goes back to why Benjamin Rush said that you got to pay attention. It's God first. God is always first. That priority is always the primary focus of our life. He said, but then you better pay attention to what's happening in your country, because if not, you're going to lose your country and your family. And that's part of what we are seeing as a crisis in America right now.
Yeah, you're so right about that. One of the best things that came out of COVID was parents being awakened to the reality of what was being taught to our children. And the lack of engagement has been a result of poor theology and philosophy. We're called to be the ecclesia, to really stand for Christ in the public square. And for, most of my Christian upbringing in my years of being a pastor, so much of the message from the arenas that I'm in is that's not a focus. That's not important. And I think we realize when we see the cultural upheaval and the cultural revolution that we're living through, if we care about people, we will care about politics, because those policies impact people. And if we really want to love our neighbor, not in the woke nonsense way that's described of loving our neighbor, which means agree with them, whatever nonsensical idea of the day is, you need to celebrate it and bow to the ideology and agree. That's not love. That's cowardice. But we are called to stand and love our neighbor and fight for the welfare of our city. And I was just thinking about that in relation to separation of church and state. One of the myths that we often hear is, the church needs to be, in the church, separate from the state, as if we're not called to be salt and light, as if we're not a constitutional republic where we're called to be we the people, engaged and involved. And we've been sold, and it's still believed by many. I'm still surprised when I hear it. It's such a red herring, or it's such a poor statement historically and just logically about the separation of church and state. So I was just going to set that up for you. Maybe talk about that for a few moments, why that's not the case and how we should be involved.
Yeah, first of all, when people use the argument of separation of church and state, what they're really arguing is we should secularize America. And that was never the founding fathers' idea. In fact, that's an anti-biblical and anti-Christian idea. If people pay attention, we already alluded to the fact that God created three institutions. He created the family, he created the government, he created the church, and he gave them all different jurisdictions, right? It wasn't the job of the government to raise kids in the fear and admonition of the Lord. That was the family. But it's not the job of the church, right? To have the sword of justice. Well, that's government, right? Romans 13, they don't raise a sword in vain. Well, similarly, it wasn't the job of the family or the church to uphold doctrine. That was what the church did. God gave them all a different responsibility and a different role. And yet in the midst of that, if you go back to the Old Testament example, Moses is the one that God gave the law to. So we would argue kind of like that's the example we see of government. Well, God put Aaron over the tabernacle. That's what we would know as a church. So Moses was government, Aaron was church. They were separate, and yet neither one was secular. And this is an important distinction. Because when people make the argument today, well, separation of church and state, what they're really arguing is we shouldn't have acknowledgments of God. We shouldn't have Christian things in public, whether it be in school, whether it be in city council, whether it be from a governor or a president. We shouldn't have nativity scenes on the court lawn. We shouldn't have crosses up around, right, with the city, whatever it is. That's what they're arguing. It's worth noting that the phrase separation of church and state appears nowhere in the Constitution. It appears nowhere in the Bill of Rights. It's not in the First Amendment. The phrase originated to the way people use and argue today. That phrase originated from a letter from Thomas Jefferson all the way back early 1800s. He wrote a letter to the Danbury Baptists. It was a small congregation in Connecticut. And when Jefferson became president, Jefferson was known as being incredibly pro-religious liberty. When Jefferson was in Virginia, Jefferson was the guy who helped Virginia cease being an Anglican state. That was the official denomination of Virginia. They were Anglican. That was the established denomination. Jefferson, as the governor, as a leader, a big advocate, says, guys, we should have religious toleration. Anybody should be welcome in our state, right? Regardless if they're a Baptist, if they're a Quaker, if they're a Presbyterian, or if they're Anglican. They knew that Jefferson was a huge advocate of religious liberty. So they wrote Jefferson a letter. And they said, President Jefferson, first of all, we're so glad you're there. You're great. We love you. We're a little nervous because we're such a small group. We're a small congregation. There's not many Baptists in America. We're afraid there might be a leader one day that comes along and says, right, we're not doing Baptists anymore. We're all going to be Episcopalians. We're all going to be Anglican. We're all going to be whatever. They said, can you do something to make sure that our religious liberty is preserved? This is the response. He writes them back, and he says, you don't need to worry about losing your religious freedom. He says, the Congress has already erected a wall of separation between church and state with the First Amendment, which says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. He goes on to explain, your religious liberty will never be threatened in America because there is a wall keeping the government away from imposing their beliefs on you and making you believe certain things. That is the context for the separation of church and state. It was never to secularize government. The understanding always was that the government is not the church and does not get to control church doctrine or church practices or behavior. So much so that during COVID, when the government said, hey, we're not going to let Christians meet in churches. Now, you can go get your alcohol. You can go to Walmart. You can go to Target. You can go to Home Depot. You can't go to churches. Nope, they can't do that. That is an actual violation of the separation of church and state. The government cannot close down churches. That is a violation. It is not a violation for a Christian president to do prayer proclamations. It's not a violation for a high school senior to say a prayer in their valedictorian or salutatorian speech. It's not a constitutional violation for students to pray on the football field before or after a football game. That's not a violation of the separation of church and state, because the idea was never to make a secular public square. The idea was to make sure the government never controlled religion and never coerced us all to being part of one denomination.
Yeah. No, that's so good. And I think it's important because, the idea that, our constitutional republic or all democracies, if you want to use those terms, should be secular is pretty nonsensical because, the reality is human beings cannot compartmentalize their morality.
No.
It's the foundation of who we are. And if we have the privilege of being a Christian in a constitutional republic or a democracy, you're absolutely called to be consistent with your Christian faith, with your voting. And so I just want to talk about that for a moment. The buzz term is that, Christian nationalism is toxic, racist, harmful, bigoted, hurtful. These, like most of the discussions in this cultural revolution, it's important to define the terms of what we're talking about because it means different things to different people. And so I'll just kind of say it like this, and I'd like you to talk about it. For me, it makes no sense that the nation should not have a civic, moral, or political identity that's not formed by its demographics. So I mentioned this on Sunday to our church. I said, America is such a Christian nation that even our curse words are Christians. We don't, when you stub your toe, say Buddha. We yell out, we don't, but I'm just saying it's common.
Right.
We hear taking the Lord's name in vain. And so it's so ridiculous, that idea. But I wanted to say this, America is neither an empire, like some Christian writers would try to suggest, or anarchy, but it's a nation that's united, it's self-governed, it's uninterested in bringing its neighbors under its rule. That's nationalism. And my opinion on this is we need more Christians that will love their nation. There's no problem when Muslims in the Middle East love their nation. There's no problem, but all of a sudden there's this big problem when Christians, which is the foundation for the morality or the supposed tolerance that everybody wants. But it's that antichrist spirit that's anti-Christian, and then we get these labels of Christian nationalism that supposedly, is Nazis and are just trying to overtake and silence everyone. And the opposite is true, in my opinion. But I want you to talk about that just for a few moments from your perspective.
Yeah, as you mentioned, it's very important to define terms. And if somebody ever accuses one of us of being a Christian nationalist, I'm going to say, well, what do you mean by that, right? What is it you think I do that makes me so bad? And more times than not, they can't really define it other than, well, you're promoting Christian values and you're promoting Christian morals. Okay, well, that makes me a Christian, right? That it's not about being a nationalist and understanding basic understanding. Every nation has a code of morals. Every single state, when you have state legislature and they pass laws, this is very important. Every single law is based on somebody's morals. Why? Because every law is based on what you can or can't do. Why? Because we think you shouldn't do things that we determine to be bad. Well, how do you determine what's bad? How do you determine what's good? Because we're going to allow it to be legal if we think it's good. So really the question is, how do we determine good and bad? How do we determine right and wrong? How do we determine moral and immoral? Because that's all we're talking about. When we at times, I'll talk with people that identify as libertarian, and they'll say, well, I don't think the government should impose morals on us. Well, so then you basically believe you shouldn't have a government because the government says you shouldn't steal. And the government says you shouldn't murder. That's morals. Everything coming from the government is morals. It's only a matter of whose morals will be upheld. And this is where it's just logical. If you begin comparing morality, and this is very important, even when you look at world religions, and whether we're talking about Christians, whether we're talking about Muslims or Buddhists and Hindu, whoever, a good comparison is to compare the heroes of those religions. Because that gives you a good feel as to who they are and what they believe. And so, well, who's the hero of Christianity? It's Jesus. Jesus is our hero. And Jesus gave a code and system of morals that has never been matched, never competed with by any other individual anywhere in the world. Now, we as Christians know it because he was God, right? That's why he was able to teach in such a way that's unparalleled by anybody else. But if we just take this basic idea of moral values, when Jesus said that you should treat other people the way you want to be treated, you should love your neighbors yourself. That don't just think about yourself, think about other people. When you start looking at the basic morals, I mean, very basic, not even complicated, very basic morals, Jesus's morals are above and beyond anywhere else. And the founding fathers made a very interesting connection. John Adams says that our Constitution was made only for a moral and a religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government and the others. What does that mean? When he said our Constitution is built on giving freedom to individuals, freedom to the people. A light just fell, sorry. We give freedom to individuals and freedom to people, but freedom only works if you have a code of morality, because if you give freedom to immoral people, right? I mean, this is the problem we're seeing in some of these major cities, that there's so much crime and so much theft, and these stores are having to close down and they're having to leave these cities because you have given freedom to immoral people, and what they're doing is immoral, and freedom no longer works. The founding fathers identified you have to have a code of morals or freedom doesn't work. And this goes back to the argument when people say, well, you're Christian nationalists. You mean the fact that I'm arguing I want us to uphold Jesus' standard of morality so we can be free makes me a Christian nationalist? Well, that's a ridiculous argument. But fundamentally, this is true. If we start looking at some of the basics of Christianity, which Jesus told the disciples, you judge a tree by the fruit. And this was important because everything that God does, Jesus said, I've come to have life and have it more abundantly. Everything that God ever did produced life.
Yes.
The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. So everything from God produces life. Everything from the devil produces death. All we have to do is look at what it produces, right? So if we look at relationships, what can you produce when you have a husband and wife, a man and woman? You can be fruitful and multiply. You can produce kids. What can you produce with two men or two women? You can know just by what it produces if something is from God or not. But I'll go even further, is there are so many studies that identify where do you find kids that are the most emotionally and mentally healthy, that are the most emotionally and mentally stable, that have the highest academic achievement, that have the lowest crime rates. Like, you start going through all these stats, they come from a home where there is a mother and father that are married, living in the home together. So what the stats are showing us is if more people did it God's way, society would be better and our nation would be better. And I'm not saying this necessarily, right, to speak judgment and condemnation over anybody listening right now. What I'm suggesting is that God's ways are the best and they work the best. And so for someone to promote God's ways that we know are the best and work the best, and then for people to be hateful and yell and scream and cuss at us and accuse us of being a bad person for promoting God's ideas, that's a silly position, that also even silly that we would want to cower from that. But this is where so often you find individuals, if you are in a debate and someone is losing the debate, what do? They change the tactic and they attack the individual because they can't win the argument. So if people are saying, oh, you're Christian nationalists, you're just bad people. So you are going the ad hominem attack. You're attacking the individual because we're not able to have an honest conversation to debate the merits of the morality we are proposing, as opposed to you saying you don't like us and you're going to call us names. Anybody who's a critical thinker should be able to identify the weakness of that position. But we have a culture that is promoting, right? If somebody says something you don't like, shout them down, tell them you don't like them, right? Oppose them on college campuses. We're seeing more and more of that. And it's because we're not training people, and especially the younger generation, they're not being equipped to be a intellectual, independent thinker. We're not teaching them to be critical thinkers and problem solvers. We are teaching them, if you don't like something, to shout it down, to call it names so that you can try to stop them, because they can't win on the merits of the argument. They have to attack the individual as a person.
Yeah, we're seeing, we know that the West has been great, and I think atheists would have to acknowledge this as well. It's because of the Judeo-Christian ethic. I mean, the West has flourished, and we're living in the abundance, the overflow, and the blessing of that. And the attack on truth, as if there's no truth, the reality is if everybody's right, then nobody's wrong. But nobody believes that. That's total nonsense. So there is this truth. There are these principles and these beliefs that are worth fighting for. And just as we kind of bring this together and close our time in this particular podcast, you shared so many great things, and I want to encourage everybody to check out. There's many resources that's on the WallBuilders website, and a lot of great content out there. But what would you encourage parents, grandparents, people listening to this that would be so important in influencing and impacting the next generation? What are we missing, and what do we need to lean in and do?
Yeah, I think the number one thing is we have to be better asking questions. When we study the Gospels, in the 4 Gospels, Jesus asked more than 300 questions. And it's interesting, Jesus answered very few questions. It's one of the great things when the Pharisees would come and they'd try to stump him, and they would say, "Hey, I've got a question for you, Jesus." And he would ask them a question back, and he would say, "Well, John's baptism, was it of God or men?" Jesus asked questions, and the disciples questioned him all the time. "Hey, who do men say that I am? But who do you say that I am?" Jesus asked questions to help people think, to help them discover truth in their own minds on that journey. And I think we have to do a better job of asking questions in general. When we hear a statement, is it true? How do we know it's true? What is the source? Or my favorite thought, I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and there was a gentleman who was on the radio. I listened to him every day that I could. His name was Paul Harvey. And he had a segment called The Rest of the Story. And I love the rest of the story, but we should ask that question. Is there more to the story? Because Paul Harvey, if for those who remember, he would give a little tease, and he would say about something that happened, and then he would walk you back through this whole story. And at the end, you would find out it was coming from some famous person, and you didn't know that was their background. And he would say, right, and now you know the rest of the story. So often in culture, we're only hearing part of the story. We don't even know that we're missing the rest of the story because we don't ask questions. We need to start asking questions. And this is also something that I think parents is a very effective and underutilized tool, even for kids, because kids are getting so much nonsense. Even if you're thinking, man, we're paying attention to their school and they're not getting this from school. Well, if they're on social media, and maybe you're like, no, we don't do social media. Like, it doesn't matter. They're going to have friends. They're going to go to somebody's house. They're going to be at the mall. They're going to do something. They're going to hear this around them. And more times than not, the other side promotes an idea that is not reasonable if asked questions. The idea of socialism.
Correct. There
was a study that 75% of college kids supported socialism. Well, I just need to ask a couple questions to help you quickly realize you're not a socialist and you don't want to be a socialist because
so they get a job, right?
that will solve a lot of problems, right? But I mean, you can ask any kid, like, man, don't you love freedom? Don't you love being able to choose what you do and where you work and how you do it? And man, don't you love money? Wouldn't you love more money? Everybody loves freedom and money. And if you then ask them, can you name any country in the history of the world that once they embraced socialism, once they became a socialist nation, any country in the history of the world, that they increased individual freedom and individual prosperity? Because it's never happened once in the history of the world. So if you love freedom and prosperity, the most logical thing for you to do is stay away from socialism, because all that's ever done is bring greater levels of poverty and greater levels of maybe not slavery, but reducing choices where it's government control. It's a greater loss of freedom along the lines. And we have to do a better job of asking questions and engaging in the conversation. For so often we have people, we don't want to ruffle feathers, right? We don't want to cause drama. I don't mean to offend anybody. I mean, I can tell you, Jesus ruffled a lot of feathers.
Yeah.
And there were times he offended people, but everything he did was in love. I think we need to remember, and you kind of pointed this out earlier, sometimes the most loving thing you can do is tell someone when they're wrong. Right. Yeah. As a father, I've got a couple little girls, and if my little girl, one of them is, going to put their hand up on the stove or put their hand in the fire, and I'm like, well, I need to let her make her choices. That's an unloving father. The most loving thing I can do is say, hey, you don't want to do that. Stay away from that. And I can explain why. We can have a conversation, but we need to do a better job about being more engaged and more active. And we don't just have to tell people they're wrong. Ask questions, have conversations, build relationships. The model of Jesus. He built relationships, he asked questions, and he led people to truth. That should be our model.
That's awesome. So good. So much good stuff. Absolutely brilliant. I really appreciate you taking the time to join us. Can't wait to have you at Freedom Life. You can check out, again, all the resources, WallBuilders. They're all over the internet, YouTube, Tim, and also his father, David, and really appreciate all that you're doing. Thanks so much for being on the podcast. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Pastor. My pleasure.
Hey, thanks so much for listening. I hope this message has inspired you to courageously stand up, speak up, and to live out your faith. If you like what you heard today, give me a 5-star review, follow the Courage Over Cowardice podcast, and share it with others to learn how to stand for truth in the midst of culture.